Too many fools blocking my motion. Carving my eyes must be the potion. Spots on my eyes must be the lotion. Love in a void, it's so numb. A void in love, it's so dumb. Love in a void. Too many bigots for my liking. Too many critics, too few writing. Rabid dogs that aren't biting. Love in a void, it's so numb. A void in love, it's so dumb. Love in a void. Jaded reputation on which you're staking. Lots of money for the making. For all the stars, they're just faking. Love in a void, it's so numb. A void in love, it's so dumb. Love in a void.
Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season, this in thee. William Shakespeare. Hamlet. And this is Radio Tipping Point. And our show today is titled Condemned to Debt. In preparation for the show, which was a long time in the making. Not that it was necessary or planned, just kind of ended up that way. Going through the archives, I've seen that there's all kinds of information that I collected. Too much that I could ever spend in this 57 minutes that we have together. But it allowed me to realize how big this subject is, how important it is, and this could possibly be the most important thing that we'll be talking about today. This concept of debt. Which is the vehicle that we have used throughout the ages to keep the populace under control, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But it's gone through various permutations, and that, my friends, would be where I would like to keep this conversation today. But let's first go back to a quote coming from Henry George, which had to have been one of the first social economists who claimed those who had a monopoly of the land would practically own those who had to use the land. And this is a quote that he put together in 1869. 1869. Pier Paolo Pasolini, in his discussions about the conditioning taking place within the school system, made the claim that the conditioning can only work because everybody's going through the same condition. And his example was looking at the first day of school, that you are reminded who is rich and who is poor. And that determination didn't come from the sky. It's very often a historical process that you were born on the right side of the tracks. But inevitably, you are born into a situation where you have plenty, or perhaps you are born into that situation where the numbers are in the red from day one. So let's start our journey together in looking at those two scenarios. Start with the one with the silver spoon in his mouth, and I say his on purpose. So there are no debts. There's plenty of cash, either liquid or tied into some sort of equity. And so you are taught at an early age, oh, from this money you make more money. So either you take the time to look and see what investments would be the best, and you will invest that money, or very possibly you might lend the money to somebody else. So with that, you continue the path that defines rich and poor. So let's take a look at the other side of the track, huh? So you were born without cash, and let's go one step further, that you were born with debt over your head. You didn't ask for that, but you got it nonetheless. So that means from day one, you're already in the hole, right? You're in the hole. So very possibly, and most probably, you'll have to go back to that first individual I talked about, the person with the cash. And just to survive, you will need to come up with some cash. And that keeps the process running. And as I mentioned, we have a very long history. In fact, if any of you are interested, there is an excellent book that I devoured not too long ago by the author David Graeber, and the book is titled Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And Graeber goes on to talk about the role that debt and in turn the slavery, which was very much tied to that. How that condition was presented throughout various cultures. And we have a long history, 5,000 years, long history, going back to ancient Mesopotamia, which for those of you who are not quite sure where Mesopotamia is to be found on the map, we're talking about Iraq today. And even back then, debt played a very important role in establishing the social structures and the various mechanisms that defined how power is bestowed, how power is bequeathed, and how power is perpetuated. And it's all tied to this concept of inequality. We talk about democracy in Greece, going back to Aristotle, Plato. But their leisure was only possible due to the condition of slavery. And slavery took on different forms because women had no rights. They might not have been called slaves, but they were slaves. And then you had the slaves that were part of the bounty that you received in conquering one city or a territory, that your prize were the slaves. And that means that very possibly you could be the slave driver on one day, and if you lose the next war, you possibly could be the slave. And we can find that within the Greek narrative of that time, that you had individuals who would play both roles. And then there was the Catholic Church, who, of course, played a very important role in ensuring that we had this level of inequality. And your hope, your redemption lied no longer in this life, but in the next one. Unless you had enough cash, which allowed you to break the rules. And because the church was always looking for cash itself, they needed to come up with a racket. And so they did, and it was called indemnity, through the form of indulgences, that you had the ability, it's almost like a joker or a wild card that you were given. You could pay for it in advance or ex post facto, but it allowed you to do whatever you wanted. And with that, we continued the path of inequality of the slaveholders and the enslaved. So let's continue on this journey. Most of you are going to be aware of what took place coming from the process of colonialism and the slave trade starting in West Africa in the early 17th century. That's primarily when it hit its stride. But what you might not know is that this was already at the end of the 18th century. There was a group that were able to repel the slaveholders, and with that, they were able to declare their freedom. And that one was louder than a bomb. Why? Because it took place at the time of the American Revolution, better said, at the time the Constitution was being formed, where this idea of 3/5 of a man was being defined as a compromise to those southern states where slavery was still being propagated. And so that area that I was talking about, where the slaves were able to overturn their condition, were able to ban the slaveholders from the territory, was Haiti. But the French had a way of continuing their plight, because the French made the claim that, okay, you have your freedom, quote unquote, but we will ensure that you are not free. And so how did they do that? They said that you owe us all kinds of money because the slaves were our assets, and the assets have been taken away from us. And so therefore you, yes, all of you, will have to pay forever and ever and ever. And those countries who were propagating slavery were very happy to support that stand, the stand that the French put through to the Haitians, because that was the biggest fear that they had, knowing full well that by keeping human beings down within a certain condition, that perhaps maybe they will figure out a way to collect their forces and perform a similar action. And so everybody else was very, very afraid that this was going to take place. And in fact, this was the biggest fear, that there will be a payday for the injustice. So that meant that the slaveholders, they knew exactly what they were doing. So righteousness didn't come into that equation. No righteousness for the slaveholders. But it was fear. Fear was what was driving them. Well, actually two things. One, they felt it was their divine right because of the superiority of the white race. And the second one was the fear of having Haiti 2.0. And we see how this process continued. Let's go to the Civil War, the United States Civil War between 1861 and 1865, where Lincoln was not looking to just free the slaves and allowing them to live in peace and in equity. He was trying to convince those spokespersons within the Afro-American community that they should all go back to Africa. And then they posed a question to Lincoln. First of all, we didn't ask to come here. And secondly, We've been here longer than you have. And if you look at the stats, it's true. But that debt that you had being born a slave, that was continued in the form of sharecropping, meaning that you had that debt over your head, which meant that you had to figure out a way to pay the debt back. And the only way that you can pay that back was to work for the individual that was actually holding the debt. And so what they would do is say, good, okay, we pay you, but we do not give you money. No money. We will give you certificates that can be traded at our county store, where, of course, the prices were 3, 4, 5 times more than you would have to spend regardless, but you were trapped. And that meant that we had a system that continued, and there was no escape. So yes, they were no longer considered to be slaves, but they remained in slavery. They remained in slavery. So slavery in North America was abolished, quote unquote. But we figured out ways to continue this process. And it was to be found within the form of colonization. And basically what the colonial powers did was they would move into an area and they would start creating some sort of infrastructure, quote unquote, for their own purposes. Then they would go to the people whose land was used, and then the colonial powers would say, hey, look what we did for you. That means you owe us this now. And it was not much different than the story that I just described tied to the sharecroppers. That the colonial powers figured out a way that it didn't matter what the colonies were doing as much as they were working, as much as they were toiling. Yes, that's what they were doing. They were toiling. That at the end of their efforts, there was never enough to pay back the debt. So freedom was never reached. And this was a way not only to ensure that the powers never lost, but they created a structure where they could only win. Didn't matter what happened, they won. Every day is a winner. So did this narrative end when we officially ended colonialism? No. If you think about the story I just told you, and the colonial powers would go in and build infrastructure that was created for their own purposes. And that allowed for them to have a ready to go moneymaker, then it might sound familiar to the story that we have today, where we give countries loans to pay for all these huge infrastructure projects. And, oh, you cannot pay for this. What are we going to do about that? Well, perhaps maybe we might confiscate some of this territory in whatever form it may be. And that's how the global south continues to be in perpetual servitude. Yes, that's what it is. Perpetual servitude. Servitude. And speaking of servitude, for those of you who just joined our status of servitude, you are listening to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled Condemned to Debt. Condemned to Debt. And this one has a very, very long history. Yes, it does. It does. It does. And we have created new forms for us to live within the system. And in all honesty, these ideas are not all that new, as you might have picked up on some of the stories that I've passed on to you so far, that you might see a commonality in the way that things are done today. We talk about the difference between equality and equity. And equality would mean that we are all the same. Which is thankfully not the case, and I mean this in a very positive way. For those of you who do follow the show, you will know that I think a lot about the subject of empowerment. And within that mindset, within an empowerment mindset, part of what we are recreating, or what we are finding once again, because we have this knowledge from day one, but we lose this knowledge for whatever reasons. We do not fit into the norm, and so we figure out ways to repress it. Those abilities are seen not to have any value, so they are negated. And we fall within the model that has been preordained. Yes, preordained. And we forget that it was all much different from day one. So back to the definition. So equality would infer that we all have the same rights. But it doesn't address this point that I have gone to, or I keep coming back to, of equity. So from day one, we are not given the same set of cards for whatever reason. And I am not referring to the dispositional. I'm talking about the societal cosmos that decided on which side of the track you actually live on. And all of this is a bit of a pendulum. We keep raising our glasses to celebrate those individuals, those one or two within the millions who were able to overcome, in spite of the lack of equity, they were still able to overcome whatever that condition might have been. And so we hold them in grand esteem, and we make the claim, yes, we make the claim, that everybody can do this. Knowing full well that not everybody has the same talents, right? So we know as human beings that had we been given different cards, that we don't know how we would have actually managed the rest. And I say this very openly as being one that was privileged in so many different forms, that I could only speculate what the reaction, the ability to rely on some sort of internal resources that I may have, some skills, some capabilities to overcome whatever that situation may be. It's always easy for us to speculate, not actually being in that situation. But we see how this condition is executed in different forms today. And so I'd like to talk about some of the forms that we have that perhaps might not necessarily be equated as being part of that modern day slavery. And of course we don't like to use these words because that's inferring a certain condition that we apparently have already eliminated. That's the claim we make. So we've eliminated debtor's prison, but we have come up with new ways to revitalize this concept. And let me go through some of the examples. So let's assume that you were born on the wrong side of the tracks, and you were born with that debt, and that debt could be symbolic. The debt could be tied to the education of your parents, the neighborhood that you live in. Obviously the race or the sex could also be a determinant here. So if we're talking about equity, if things were not equal, then you could look at that as being a form of debt. And that might be a good idea to keep that concept in mind while I attempt to go through this narrative. And if we look at the number of individuals who are incarcerated in the United States today, and if we were to perform a demographic exercise and figure out, so where do most of these people come from? Well, I think you already know what that answer is. And let's not even talk about the means by which they are put into that predicament, which are anything but equal. So one of the objectives that we have in this grand creation called debt is to keep others docile. We want to keep them quiet. We want to keep them passive so that they do not become a threat to our power base. And if you think about the example I gave you earlier tied to what took place at the end of the 18th century in Haiti, you had the big fear on the one side, and you had the huge debt, which unfortunately the people of Haiti were never able to overcome. And that we're not able to own up to our collective responsibility vis-a-vis that of what took place over 200 years ago truly is beyond my comprehension. Because it's so obvious, it's so apparent, it's so damning, and damn it all, if it's not shameful, yes, it's shameful. So let's continue on the path. We look at the demographics, primarily Afro-American men. Who are straddled with this debt in some fashion. And it could be something very simple that most of us have no clue of what it would be like. And that could either be being thrown on the streets, not having a place to live, or not having enough to eat, or some other melody that could take place, or maybe, and they're not mutually exclusive, you can end up with all three or with multiples. So you're put in that situation, and you feel that your back is against the wall, and you feel that you have nothing to lose, right? You have nothing to lose. And all you could think about is figuring out some way to get past the day. And if we look at the stress factor, just let's transport ourselves into the situation of an individual who doesn't have enough money and you have deadlines coming up, right? So you can borrow from Peter to pay Paul only so long that Peter's going to want his money back. And let's assume that Peter is the landlord, and Peter's going to want his money by the first of the month. And you know that you don't have the money to pay Peter by the first of the month. And we get closer and closer and closer to that magic day, the first of the month. And you're thinking the whole time, damn, how am I going to pay Peter? How am I going to pay Peter? And let's continue on that journey. And let's say that we are on the 30th or the 31st of the month. And you know you cannot pay Peter. Nope, you cannot pay him. And this would not be so bad but you were not able to pay Peter the last time. And Peter told you, if you don't pay all of it by the first, not the second, not the third, the first, then you're out on the street. So what would you do? What would you do in that situation, huh? And this is really my point. If we're not in that situation, we can speculate what our reaction would be, but we really don't know. And I, for one, would like to think that I would come up with some sort of ingenious way to get Peter the money. And it's very possible that that ingenious solution could possibly get me in trouble. I don't know what that solution would be, and I don't want to think about what it would be like. So, our solution to keep the others docile is to set a lesson and jacking up the odds that if you try that thing, that very possibly you're going to be sent to the pokey. Yes, you're going to be sent to jail. Do not go past go. You go straight to jail. And then once you end up in that confines, looking at the question of debt, looking at the question of equality, looking at your fate, right, we do not call this slavery, but it's not too far off the mark, folks. It's not too far off the mark. And this debt could have come through some sort of freak event, which is actually not that freaky. Freaky being out of the ordinary. Of being afflicted with some sort of sickness. Let's call it a rare sickness. Let's call it a debilitating sickness. Let's call it a sickness that becomes all-consuming. And let's assume that it's not you who has the sickness, but there's somebody in your family that has that sickness. And you hold a certain level of responsibility. There are costs to be accrued, depending upon where you live, to cover the costs of that sickness. And let's face it, the sickness is debilitating and there is no cure. And that person passes away. But then you have the debt. Right, you have the debt. And that becomes a vicious circle, one that you cannot escape because you need to figure out ways to cover the amount, which is that you can never cover through legal means, and certainly not being able to earn enough money, quote unquote, to cover the debt. So we've created another model so that you stay perpetually in debt. And for some reason, which totally escapes me, we have created a new form of this slavery. And thank goodness we are not confronted with this problem living here in Austria. But there are a number of countries, also within the EU, that have marched down this path. It was last month that I met somebody who studied in the United States. And she told me that she has debts of $200,000. She's finished her studies, and she has debts of $200,000. How is she ever going to pay that back? Unless she takes on a position that's only the only driver is for her to figure out a way to pay back the 200 grand. So either she figures out a way to get out of that debt through other means, or she needs to create some sort of structure to live her life that she can finally have that 200,000 covered. And of course, she's not alone. There are plenty out there. And one of the arguments that I've heard tied to this concept of student debt was, well, these individuals were privileged because they were able to go to university. In other words, we shouldn't lament about their situation too much because they were privileged to begin with. And I don't know about you, but I would not consider to have a debt of $200,000 to be a privilege. Do you see a continuity between all of these examples I've been giving you so far today, in the way that we inherit debt from day one, whatever form that debt may take? That we have these structures within society that make it virtually impossible for us to be free of the debt. That we have an economic system that's based on growth, quote unquote, that requires us all to take on loads and loads of debt. We haven't even talked about personal debt so far. And there's no area that is spared of that personal debt. And I can come up with an interesting statistic, a very sobering statistic that I stumbled across in preparation for the show, that 80% of Indian rural households, peasants and non-peasants, are in debt. 80%. And of course, their agricultural work does not pay them enough to pay back the debts. And so this has become a vicious circle. And in fact, when we look at the protests that were taking place due to the agricultural reform that the Modi government was trying to pass through maybe a couple of years ago, last year, I'm not quite sure, that the rural farmers felt that they had nothing to lose. And in fact, the Modi government had to back down. But the condition doesn't change. It only meant that we don't try to address the symptoms. We do not question the root cause. And we consider all this to be standard fare. Yes, that's the way that things are. It's the way that we expect them to be. And with that, it's all considered to be normal. So, within the remaining time that we have together today, let's look and see whether we can come up with some new approaches, I don't know how new they are, that would allow us to make some real progress. So the first one is to understand these vicious cycles tied to debt, and we need to figure out ways to break them. So that means we need to, within our own domain, because that's really the only area that we can directly affect, look within our own domain, understand these cycles, and let's figure out ways of how we can break them. Either in the form of debt relief, or we make sure that these models simply do not work anymore. If we believe that the problem aren't people, the problem are structures, and if we create proper structures, then people would be able to live in peace, in tranquility, and in harmony. Maybe not every day, but a hell of a lot better than we've been doing so far. So we look at that on a smaller level. What about what we are doing, either within our country or perhaps within our region, that helps perpetuate this dependency? And I'll give you one very poignant example, and it's tied to agriculture in Africa. That the only way that they can grow, quote unquote, is to grow products that they would not eat themselves, but they were basically for our market. And there was a show that I did a while back, and I was talking about green beans. And that our green beans here in Austria, if you look at the can, shouldn't be surprised that they're coming from Kenya. And because they have also been told that it needs to be bigger, the areas of agriculture need to be larger, because that's the only way that they can gain revenue is by coming out with cash crops they can export. So can we do something about that? Yes, we refuse to buy those things that are leaving individuals in the global south in that servitude. That's something we could do. What about the educational system that forces individuals to make certain compromises due to the fact of that heavy burden that's been put on their shoulders? There, I think the debt is only the symptom. The root cause lies somewhere completely different. And so the whole idea of education and the value it has in our society and the actual cost, and who is being supported by all these costs, and what's the value that is actually being accrued through this system. But is knowledge something that we cannot share with each other? Can we come up with new models that breaks the chain tied to these vicious cycles? So there we are. There we are on a Tuesday in August. And I personally believe that this problem of debt, I was not aware of how this vehicle has been used throughout the ages. And through looking at how it was applied previously, understanding that the verbiage might be a little bit different, but the processes are pretty much the same. That by us being aware of that condition and where the problem lies, with us being able to come up with alternate ways in holding that sense of responsibility for those that perhaps were not given the same deck of cards that we were, that indeed we do hold the responsibility. And we also hold the means by which we can create something much better. And that's something I wish for all of you this week. Stay cool. I appreciate you listening. And I indeed will be back. I will be back next week. Thanks.